Okay, for this week's assignment, I am going to go over with you a PowerPoint on universal design. And usually we hear it as universal design for learning. So I'm going to go ahead and run through. So universal design is related to the concept of accessibility, and accessible definition is something is accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. So that's kind of a mouthful, but essentially we're talking about accessibility and learning. We're talking about giving them the same opportunities. So we're going to talk about accessibility in terms of the physical environment, but this is accessibility in terms of the learning environment. And there is a reference there at the bottom if you want to look that up. So why is accessibility so important these days? Well, it's always been important, but one of the things that is happening at many schools, especially in higher education, is disability rights organizations and students with disabilities have filed lawsuits against numerous universities and colleges in the recent past. Now, that's not to say that public schools are not also under the gun in that sense. They are, but some of the most important cases, I guess, have been at the higher ed level. So you'll see over here it talks about Arizona State and Northwestern Florida State, Penn State, even right here in town, Palmer College just had a recent case about a blind student, and they were ruled against. The student who was blind the court case came out in favor of him. So this, let me just take you to this link really quick. This is a link, and I may need to make this a little bigger if I can. There we go. Okay, so there's higher ed accessibility lawsuits. This website actually takes you to some more information, I guess, about that. And so as you scroll down here, talks about the typical scenario of what happens and what is accessible. And here are the many cases that have occurred since 2013. Before that, Louisiana Tech, University of Montana. So many times it is an accessibility of websites that are getting people in trouble. So I just wanted to go back to that. Now I've got to move this back over again. There we go. So what exactly is universal design? Well, universal design refers to the broad spectrum of ideas meant to produce learning environments that are inherently accessible to all, regardless of their age, their ability, their status in life. So one of the most important points I always like to make is universal design is not the same as making accommodations for people with disabilities. A lot of times people think, oh, okay, well, I don't have to worry about this because I don't have a student with a disability in my class. Universal design kind of throws that on its head because it doesn't care whether you have a specific student with a disability. The idea is that you should build everything for as many people as possible and not wait for someone who has some kind of issue to come in and then make the changes. So where did this come from? Actually, universal design came from the building world. It came from architecture. And so in building, they started doing universal design a long time ago. You design all products and the built environment to be aesthetic, but also usable to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of their age, ability, and status in life. So I just threw some pictures. These are from Black Hawk College, and my neighborhood on the far right. But basically, these are some examples of universal design in our lives. Look at elevators. Yes, do elevators help people who have disabilities? Absolutely they do. But I think we all can agree, unless we're phobic of elevators, we've all used them before, and we've used them because we're tired. We've used them because there's 70 flights to go up. We've used them because we've got stuff that we're carrying. So elevators are an example of universal design in our lives. Even though it is true that if a building doesn't have an elevator, they will, somebody with a disability could, if it's a public building, of course, could, file a lawsuit because they should have access to that. Elevators actually are for everybody. And same thing with automatic doors. I know there's a little person on there in terms of being in a wheelchair, but we all use automatic doors. I mean, I've used it. I don't use it all the time, but if I've got a big box in my hand, I might do it. I notice people that are going into the bathroom. There's an automatic door there, and I notice people will hit their elbow on it. Well, when I was kind of like, why are they doing that? Well, some people are germ phobic, and they don't want to touch they don't want to touch it with their hands, so they touch it with their elbow, the door even, and then of course they can hit this button just with their elbows. If you look at the last picture, that's my little dog on the corner there, on my corner of the street. You'll see curb ramps, and curb ramps, of course, are good for somebody who is in a wheelchair, but if you think about it, somebody who's pushing a baby stroller. My mother, when she was in her, last year, when she was having so much trouble getting around, even one step was difficult. So that kind of a curb ramp is very, very helpful. Somebody on a bicycle, that would be, really nice to have as well. So it's the whole idea of when we are building things in the built environment, like in houses now and things like that, a lot of times they're thinking, well, maybe we should, build it for anybody if possible, so people are paying more attention to some of those things. So, universal design for learning in the classroom. As teachers, we have typically designed instruction toward the middle. That's who we kind of focus on. When we do that, we tend not to be using universal design because we're basically saying we're not trying to get to as many people as possible. We're not trying to be universal. We're just trying to get the majority. So universal design is basically saying, no, let's actually design to the corners. Let's design to the far corners. And then if we design towards the edges, practically everybody will be able to use it. So it's kind of a different idea, which is exactly the idea we have in buildings, but now we're taking that to the learning environment. And again, we're taking it to the learning environment because there have been some court cases and things like that. But it really is, if you think about it, the moral thing to do in many ways. Let's make education, which is everybody's right, let's make it something that everyone has as much access to as possible, regardless of whether they have an actual disability or not. So the rule of thumb for UDL, so that's Universal Design for Learning, is to try to design all materials and lessons universally when you originally create them and teach them. Well, we could have a whole course on this if we wanted, but there are a couple of rules of thumb that I always like to point out to people. First, consider representing materials in 2 different ways. That is universal design, just by doing that. Provide both a doc file and a PDF file. Let's say you're doing something online on Edmodo. Provide them both. You now are using universal design. Let's say you have a video. Have it with closed captioning. You've got the auditory through the video, the auditory and the visual, but then the closed captioning would be helpful for somebody who obviously can't hear, but it can be immensely helpful for many other people. Sometimes people benefit from closed captioning just because they are an ELL student. They are a person who has a kind of a listening issue. Maybe it's not a disability, but they just don't hear well. I'll tell you when I use closed captioning. When I watch any British TV show, I cannot understand the accent. I watch that show Downton Abbey, that one on PBS. I can't understand them. So I turn on the closed captioning, and it helps me because I just don't pick up on that accent. Do I have a disability? No. But it helps me. It helps me understand what's going on. The other thing is, a second area is start doing the easy stuff. Tag images in presentations. This up here is actually tagged, and it's really quite easy to do. Let me see if I can go ahead and take this off and do it. I can't get down to my, no, I can't quite get down to my controls there. But anyway, it's really quite easy to tag an image and say this is a thumbs up. And that way, the reason why that's important is because if a screen reader is reading this, so let's say a person is blind, if a screen reader is reading it and a picture comes along, it will tell them what is in the picture. So it'll say picture of thumbs up. Okay. Use YouTube's automatic captioning. We're going to see that a little bit later in this semester in a couple weeks. I'd like you guys to all become familiar with that. YouTube has closed captioning. It happens automatically, not always immediately, but it happens very, very quickly. Like within a couple of hours, they close caption, but it's automatic, so it's not perfect. So you might have, you know, you're always going to have to go back and do some tweaking to it, but it's, I think they're saying about 70 to 80% accurate. Use the headings in Word. When you do a Word document, a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this too, if I have a title like right here, what I do is I highlight it and then I bold it and make it bigger. Well, actually, Word already has a system in there that would do that for you, that will put in titles and things like that. The reason why that's important is because when a screen reader reads that, it will actually recognize it as a title. A screen reader, if you're just putting in bigger font and your own bold, it's not going to necessarily read that as easily. Allow students to represent their learning in more than one way. For example, allow students to either write a paper or to create a podcast. In other words, they could talk their paper to you. Okay, so anytime you're doing those things where you're trying to do two things, that's always going to be helpful. So YouTube captioning that I just mentioned began a couple of years ago, and so there's quite a few, and all the recent videos have captioning. Most people don't even realize it's there. It's about 70-80% accurate, and if you create and upload a video, you can actually edit the captioning. So this video that I'm doing right now, I will be able to put it up on YouTube, and then I will be able to go through and correct everything that is incorrect on the automatic captioning. So it's free, and it's probably the easiest captioning process available today, especially if you're using YouTube. It's perfect in that sense. So universal design for technology you use in class, always take the time to consider how you can design it more universally. So for our class, you will use universal design in the coming weeks on several assignments. So please make a copy of this PowerPoint to refer back to if necessary, or just make sure you know where it's at in our course so that you can think back, because you will have to do something and be able to express, I have done this to make this more universal for students. And so you're always looking for more than one way to present something. Again, it'll not only help your students with disabilities, it'll help people with different learning styles. It will help people who, who just learn in a different way in some way. And so oftentimes those things that we do universally help many different types of people.